Okay, when you're ready.
Okay. Some people say all this talk about the Highland clearances is to a certain extent avoiding what was really happening, and you should talk about Highland and Lowland clearances, because at the same time as the Highland landlords, who were the chiefs who'd be made into landlords by the London and Edinburgh authorities, at the same time as they were clearing the clansfolk off the land in order to make large farms run by large farmers who paid them large rents, which is why they did it. At the same time as these Highland clearances, there were a lot of small farmers being cleared off the land in the Scottish Lowlands. And so you should remember about the Lowland clearances. But they are two completely different things. The real, if you look on a map of Great Britain, that's England, Wales, Scotland, and the important barriers appear to be between England and Wales, and then between England and Scotland, a line drawn across the country a bit squiggly-piggledy from Berwick-on-Tweed to just north of Carlisle, Gretna Green, that kind of area. And beyond that is Scotland, and this side is England. But Scotland was never a united country until after the Battle of Culloden, because after then, during the second half of the 18th century, the beginnings of what we now know as the Industrial Revolution was starting, and various people were making it possible to make very efficient pumps because you needed more and more coal to keep the factories going, and you had, the further you dug down, the more water you came to, so the better pumps you had to have to pump the water up at the top and clear the coal face so that coal miners could go in and get you the coal. And in order to make better pumps, you have to make an exact circle out of a kind of barrel shape, which is the pump, so that the thing going in back and forward inside it goes exactly to enclose or to fill up this shape and make a good pump. And having done that, they found that you could do the same thing with cannon, and you can make an exact circle, and therefore more of the power that you were exploding, the back end of the pipe, which is the cannon, to drive the projectile forward, was more and more efficient. Again, rifles, or rather muskets, were more and more efficient the more you could get an exact round shape going from the trigger to the top end of the musket. And so with all these things, and furthermore, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and the beginnings of the British Empire, all of them made more ability for the government to put up taxes. If there's more going on, more people making fortunes, okay, you can demand that they give you 10% in tax to run the country. So there's more money coming in, more knowledge going out. And so after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the state of England and Scotland, which had just joined up in 1707, the Act of Union, to make one big country, was much more powerful, and they could more or less invade the Highlands. Up to then, when Dr. Johnson went up, along with James Boswell, on the famous visit to the Highland in 1773, he said, no wonder these people were independent for such a long time, because every new crag, every new mountain top is a new fortress, and anybody trying to conquer the country has to go against this fortress, then the next mountain top, and the next one, and so on. And he said just a few men with heavy projectiles at the top of the mountain could defend a whole area of country against a whole army of troops down below them. So this is why the Highland clearances only took place after these developments about the middle of the 18th century. But what about the lowlands? All this had happened in the lowlands much before. Oh, 1,000 years or more before. Where did the lowlanders, as I was saying earlier, there were two peoples in Scotland, and so far they're much mixed up now, but up to say 1700 there were two peoples. The lowlanders were people who'd come like the English from the other side of the North Sea, from Flanders, what's now Holland and Belgium, a little bit of Denmark, a little bit of North Germany. There's one theory is that the land was sinking, and so driving more people across the North Sea to find a place to settle. And they were the same as English, and they spoke the same language, obviously with a different accent, a different dialect, so that a Cockney and a Glaswegian will probably have a job understanding each other straight away. But the fact is, the basic language was English. But as soon as you get beyond the Highland line, which you can draw across the map of Scotland from Helensburgh right up to part of Caithness, as soon as you draw that line, across the line, they spoke a different language. And they hadn't come from the northern European coast, they'd come from Ireland. And they spoke what was called, and probably still is, but certainly up to very recently, was called Irish. And it is still mutually intelligible with the language spoken in Ireland. When I took my family, or my wife and I took our family up to the Highlands of Scotland to stay on holiday, we got talking to the locals, the Highlanders, who spoke Gaelic, and I said to them, what do in Ireland they have broadcasts in Irish Gaelic? And they said, yes, we get those broadcasts and we can understand them. We laugh a bit of some of the words they use, some of the constructions they use, but it's basically the same language and we can understand it. So it was the Highlanders had come from Ireland, and the Lowlanders had come from across the North Sea, and they were quite different. And the society they established was different. The Lowlanders started by being something like the Highlanders, a tribe or a clan, if you want to call it that, would settle in a certain area, and they would have a chief appointed. But in the Lowlands, that chief, 1,000 years before it happened in the Highlands, the local chief was able to make himself into a landlord, because there was no great mountain to overcome. If one chief made himself into a landlord and people objected to it, he could get other chiefs and their forces to come and assist them, which you couldn't do in the Highlands. So although it's called the lowland clearances, they're not clearances in the same sense. They're simply a change in the use of the soil from a lot of small farmers to a few big farmers. Now, what happened to the small farmers? The small farmers gathered in local villages or even more in the industrial towns, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Paisley and so on, in that middle belt of Scotland where factories were opening up in the, what we just talked about, the Industrial Revolution. And this was all happened over 1,000 years before the Highland clearances, 1,000 or more years, because there was no mountains to enable the ordinary people to defend themselves against the great influence of the chiefs or owners, as they very soon became, landlords. So you had Scottish lowland landlords 1,000 years or more before you had Scottish Highland landlords, and that was the reason the terrain. The lowlands was too low for them to defend themselves. The highlands with the mountains enabled the ordinary people to defend themselves. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, I hope you will subscribe, and I hope you will press the notification bell. And by all means write in to tell us what you think, whether you agree or not. By all means disagree, and if you do disagree, please give me an indication of where I can get my ideas right again. Thank you.